We have all seen the wellness influencers rattling off Bible verses about healing plants like they cracked some ancient code. But what the data actually shows is something far more interesting than a simple list of herbs. Scholars have now cross-referenced biblical texts with Egyptian papyri, Mesopotamian clay tablets, and post-biblical Jewish literature. And what they found changes everything about how we think of ancient medicine. We're counting down 20 of these plants today, and by the end, you won't think of the biblical world as isolated ever again. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Number 1. Aloe. Aloe vera sits in grocery store lobbies today, but it was moving across open water and desert caravan routes long before most empires had a navy, and the biblical world was buying it regularly. Here's what makes that interesting. Aloe vera doesn't grow natively in the Levant at all. It originates along the coasts of East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, so every time it showed up in a biblical context, someone had already paid serious money to ship it there. The biblical references point to a dried resinous extract, not the fresh gel you'd snap from a leaf today. That dried form was dense enough to transport and stable enough to store, and Egyptian physicians were already using aloe preparations for skin conditions and embalming before the biblical texts were even written. Modern pharmacology has since confirmed that anthraquinones and polysaccharides in aloe genuinely accelerate wound healing. The ancients weren't guessing. They were paying import prices for something that actually worked. Number 2. Frankincense. Most people file frankincense under church incense and move on, which means they miss the actual story. Boswellia sacra, the tree that produces it, grows in a narrow band of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, and getting it to Jerusalem meant crossing some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Traders were doing that regularly, at scale, for centuries, and entire city-states in southern Arabia existed specifically to keep that supply chain running. Egyptian medical texts and post-biblical Jewish sources both document frankincense as a treatment for respiratory conditions, wound care, and inflammation. Modern research on boswellic acids, the active compounds in the resin, shows they inhibit a specific enzyme tied to the inflammatory response. That's a measurable mechanism, not folklore. When Egyptian physicians, Mesopotamian healers, and biblical writers all independently reach the same conclusion about a plant, that's cross-cultural corroboration, and it's about as close to a clinical trial as the ancient world could run. Number 3. Myrrh. Myrrh shows up in anointing oils, burial preparations, and the gifts of the Magi. And that kind of consistency across wildly different contexts is actually a pharmacological clue, not a literary one. Commiphora species, the trees that produce myrrh, grow in the dry woodlands of East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Myrrh had no business being in the Levant unless someone was running a serious import operation, and the fact that it appears in Egyptian and Mesopotamian medical texts independently, before the biblical period, tells us that trade network was ancient even by ancient standards. What myrrh actually does is inhibit bacterial and fungal growth. The compounds responsible, sesquiterpenes and furanocysquiterpenes, have confirmed broad-spectrum antimicrobial activity in modern lab studies. Ancient Egyptian surgeons packed wounds with myrrh-based preparations because it slowed infection. In a world without antibiotics, that wasn't a ritual. It was emergency medicine. Myrrh's identity and its chemistry are both well established, which puts it in a rare category on this list. Number 4. Hyssop. Unlike the 3 imported resins we just covered, hyssop actually grew in the region, and it's one of only 5 plants the Bible explicitly names as medicinal. No trade invoice required. The Hebrew word azov has caused debate for a long time because it could map to several different plants, but philological analysis lands firmly on Oreganum syriacum, Syrian oregano, a plant that still grows wild across the Levant today. What makes that identification so solid is the chemistry. Oreganum syriacum contains high concentrations of carvacrol and thymol, 2 phenolic compounds that disrupt bacterial cell membranes. Clinical studies have confirmed this, so when biblical purification rituals called for hyssop to cleanse wounds, that wasn't ceremony for ceremony's sake. It was applying a genuine antimicrobial to broken skin. The imported resins got the glory, but hyssop was doing consistent, everyday work as the foundation everything else got layered on top of. Number 5, olive. Olive oil is so common in Mediterranean cooking that it's easy to forget it was also the delivery system for most of the medicine we've covered so far. Frankincense, myrrh, and other imported resins had to be dissolved or suspended in something stable before they could be applied to skin or taken internally. Olive oil was that medium, and without a locally produced fat to carry those compounds, the whole import trade would have been far less useful. Olea europaea is native to the Levant, so it didn't need to be shipped in. The Good Samaritan parable names olive oil explicitly as a wound treatment, and modern research backs that up. Oleocanthal, a compound in olive oil, inhibits the same inflammatory enzymes that ibuprofen targets. The polyphenols in the oil support tissue repair on top of that. A mature olive grove also took decades to establish and produced for centuries, making it stored wealth as much as stored medicine. Number 6, figure. Of all the plants we've covered, fig has the clearest medical credential in the actual text. 2 Kings records a specific instruction. Prepare a poultice of figs and apply it to the boil. That's not a metaphor. That's a prescription. The chemistry behind it holds up. Ficus carica contains ficin, a proteolytic enzyme that breaks down dead tissue. Modern wound care calls that enzymatic debridement, and it's a standard clinical approach for cleaning infected lesions. Ancient physicians were doing the same thing with a crushed fig. The botanical identification is rock solid, too. The Hebrew te'ena maps directly to Ficus carica, and archaeobotanical evidence puts fig cultivation in the Levant back at least 9,000 years before the biblical text was even written. So for fig, you've got explicit biblical prescription, a confirmed botanical ID, documented cultivation going back millennia, and a plausible biochemical mechanism. That's a complete evidentiary chain, and most plants on this list can't claim all four. Number 7, pomegranate. Pomegranate gets treated as decoration in most biblical readings, a symbol of fertility carved into temple walls. But the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts we have, documents pomegranate root bark as a targeted treatment for intestinal parasites. That's not symbolic. That's a protocol, written down because it worked repeatedly enough to be worth recording. The compounds responsible are punicolagens and ellagic acid, concentrated in the rind and root, and they're genuinely toxic to certain parasites at the levels found naturally in the plant. Modern research has since focused on how punicolagens break down in the body into compounds called urolithins, which show anti-inflammatory activity in clinical studies, with ongoing research into gut health effects. Punica granatum originated in the region stretching from Iran to northern India, so its presence in the Levant came through trade. By the biblical period, it was fully cultivated there, but the original material traveled east to west, same as most of the pharmacopoeia. Number 8, cedar. Most of the Bible's references to Cedrus libani are about construction, not medicine. Solomon's temple, royal palaces, structural timber. But the same chemistry that made cedar wood rot-resistant and insect-resistant also made it useful in medical contexts, and the Egyptians figured that out early. Cedar oil showed up in Egyptian embalming preparations, and that tells you something concrete about what it does. Embalming means preserving biological tissue against microbial decay, so the compounds doing that work, sesquiterpenes like cedrol and cedrine, have documented antimicrobial and antifungal properties. They weren't using cedar because it smelled good. They were using it because it stopped things from rotting. Post-biblical Jewish sources pair cedar with hyssop in purification rituals, and we've already seen that hyssop carries real antimicrobial activity. That pairing wasn't accidental. You didn't need to extract and purify anything either. Wood shavings, bark, and oil all carried enough active chemistry to produce a measurable effect in whole plant form. Number 9. Cinnamon. Cinnamomum verum is native to Sri Lanka. Not Arabia, not East Africa, Sri Lanka. And it shows up in the biblical anointing oil recipe given to Moses, listed by weight alongside myrrh. Getting cinnamon from Sri Lanka to Jerusalem meant either a maritime route through the Indian Ocean and up the Red Sea, or an overland caravan through India, Persia, and Mesopotamia. Either way, you're looking at roughly 5,000 kilometers of supply chain. Archaeologists have actually found cinnamon residue in Iron Age wine flasks from the Phoenician coast, so we know it arrived physically, not just textually. The active compound in cinnamon bark is cinnamaldehyde, and modern clinical trials have confirmed it improves insulin sensitivity and carries real antimicrobial and antifungal activity. Ancient physicians didn't know what cinnamaldehyde was, but they paid extraordinary prices for the bark anyway, which tells you they were observing real results and responding rationally to what they saw. Number 10. Mustard. Mustard looks boring on paper, and that's exactly why it gets skipped. But crush a mustard seed and mix it with water, and you trigger a chemical reaction that produces isothiocyanates, the compounds responsible for that sharp heat. Ancient physicians were applying those compounds directly to skin through poultices, increasing local circulation and delivering real antimicrobial activity to wounds. That's not folk medicine guesswork. That's transdermal drug delivery. Sinapis alba and Brassica nigra are both native to the Mediterranean and Near East, so mustard didn't need a trade route. Ordinary people could grow it, harvest it, and use it without paying import prices for anything. Modern research on isothiocyanates has since moved into cancer biology, with ongoing studies examining these compounds as chemopreventive agents. The ancient application was completely different, but the chemistry driving both is identical. The Talmud documents mustard in medical use long after the biblical period closed. Number 11. Garlic. 20+ prescriptions in a single ancient medical text isn't a coincidence. The Ebers papyrus documents Allium sativum more than almost any other plant in that collection, which tells you Egyptian physicians weren't experimenting casually. They'd tested it, repeated it, and written it down as protocol. When you crush a garlic clove, a lion converts to allicin, a broad-spectrum antimicrobial with confirmed activity against bacteria, fungi, and some viruses. In a world without antibiotics, that's not a kitchen ingredient. That's a wound treatment. Egyptian laborers building the pyramids reportedly received garlic rations to maintain their health during heavy work, and modern clinical trials have since confirmed garlic's effects on blood pressure, cholesterol, and immune function through the same allicin pathway. Garlic originated in Central Asia and arrived via trade, but it was fully cultivated throughout Egypt and the Levant by the biblical period, making it one of the clearest examples of an import that became a staple. Number 12. Onion. Garlic gets all the attention, but Allium CPA has its own clinical record, and it's worth treating them as separate tools rather than the same one. The Ebers papyrus lists onion alongside garlic in several prescriptions, and Mesopotamian medical texts document it independently. The cross-cultural record is consistent. Onion contains quercetin, a flavonoid that blocks histamine release from mast cells, which is the exact same mechanism modern antihistamine drugs target. Ancient Egyptian physicians used onion preparation specifically for chest complaints, and they were right to, because quercetin has documented bronchodilatory effects in modern research. They were working with a natural antihistamine without knowing histamine existed. Allium CPA originated in Central Asia, but was cultivated in Egypt by at least 3,200 BCE. So by the biblical period, it was fully domesticated in the region. Quercetin is now one of the most studied polyphenols in clinical research, with active trials examining its effects on inflammation, cardiovascular health, and viral infections. Number 13. Balm of Gilead. When Jeremiah asks whether there's no balm in Gilead, that question only lands if the audience already knows balm as the thing you reach for when a wound turns serious. By the time that line was written, Commiphora gileadensis had that reputation locked in. Ancient sources describe the resin as so precious it needed royal protection, and Josephus records it as one of the region's most prized exports. The harvest came in tiny quantities, which kept the price extraordinary. What makes this one different from frankincense and myrrh is that Commiphora gileadensis was cultivated locally in the Jordan Valley, not imported. The region wasn't buying this one. It was selling it. Commiphora resins carry terpenoids and sesquiterpenes with documented antimicrobial and wound-healing properties, and ancient physicians applied the balm to wounds, used it in cosmetic preparations, and administered it as a systemic treatment. Genesis puts balm of Gilead in a caravan heading to Egypt, which means it was moving internationally as a premium commodity before most of the biblical text existed. Number 14, mint. In Matthew 23, Jesus criticizes the Pharisees for tithing mint while ignoring justice. A tithe is a tax, and you don't tax things that don't matter, so that single verse tells you mint carried real economic weight in the ancient world. Mentha longifolia, wild mint, is the most likely species for the Levant, and it grows without much help, spreading aggressively and producing menthol in high concentrations even without cultivation. Menthol relaxes smooth muscle in the gastrointestinal tract, which is exactly what you want when someone's dealing with cramping or spasm. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and post-biblical Jewish sources all document mint for digestive complaints independently, and that cross-cultural consistency points to observed results. Modern clinical guidelines now include enteric-coated peppermint oil capsules as a standard treatment for irritable bowel syndrome. Ancient physicians didn't know the mechanism, but they had the right plant for the right condition. Number 15. Saffron. Saffron appears in the Song of Solomon alongside myrrh, cinnamon, and frankincense, which puts it in the most expensive company the ancient world could assemble. Every flower of Crocus sativus produces exactly 3 stigmas, and every one of those stigmas gets picked by hand. That's why it's still the most expensive spice on Earth today, and it was just as expensive then. The clinical evidence on saffron is genuinely surprising. Randomized controlled trials have compared saffron extract directly against standard antidepressant medications for mild to moderate depression and found comparable results. The compounds responsible, crocin, quercetin, and safranal, inhibit serotonin reuptake, which is the same mechanism SSRI drugs target. Ancient physicians used saffron for mood regulation and sedation without knowing any of that biology, but they were observing a real neurochemical effect. A commodity that expensive survives in a competitive market for one reason. It kept producing results people were willing to pay for. Number 16. Almond. Aaron's rod in Numbers doesn't just bud overnight. It flowers and produces almonds, and the choice of almond wasn't random. Prunus dulcis blooms earlier than almost any other tree in the Levant, sometimes as early as January, so it already carried a reputation for early action before the biblical writers touched it. Ancient Egyptian cosmetic texts document almond oil for skin care, and post-biblical Jewish sources put it in medical preparations. The oil is rich in oleic acid, linoleic acid, and vitamin E, which support the skin's barrier and reduce moisture loss. Modern dermatology has confirmed exactly that in clinical studies. But here's what actually separates almond from other carrier oils on this list. Ancient practitioners knew which variety to use. Bitter almonds contain amygdalin, which breaks down into hydrogen cyanide at sufficient doses. Sweet almond oil went on skin. Bitter almonds stayed out of the preparation entirely. That's botanical discrimination, not guesswork. Number 17, grapevine. Wine in the biblical world wasn't something you poured at dinner first. It was something you poured on a wound. The Good Samaritan parable names wine explicitly as a wound treatment alongside olive oil, and scholars read that as a reflection of standard medical practice, not a literary flourish. Vitis vinifera came to the Levant from the Caucasus region through centuries of trade and cultivation, and by the biblical period, wine production ran through the entire agricultural economy of the Near East. Ethanol at wine concentrations, roughly 10 to 15%, kills many common wound pathogens on contact. The polyphenols in grape skin, particularly resveratrol, add anti-inflammatory activity on top of that. So ancient physicians were applying a multi-compound antimicrobial preparation without knowing the chemistry. Modern pharmacology now studies resveratrol for cardiovascular health and cellular aging. The wine trade and the medicine trade weren't separate industries in the ancient Near East. Number 18. Wheat. Wheat seems like a strange entry in a medicinal plant list until you remember that the ancient world didn't draw a clean line between food and medicine. A population that isn't starving has a working immune system. That's not philosophy. That's biology. Triticum species were cultivated in the Fertile Crescent going back at least 9,000 years before the biblical period. And by the time the biblical texts were written, wheat shaped the economy, the tax system, and the social structure of every major society in the region. Whole wheat carries B vitamins, iron, zinc, and arabinoxalan, a prebiotic fiber that feeds beneficial gut bacteria. Ancient populations were getting genuine nutritional medicine in every meal without knowing it. What's interesting is that thousands of years of farmer selection also improved wheat's digestibility and nutrient density over wild varieties. Ancient farmers ran a slow-motion breeding program that optimized their primary medicine without ever calling it that. Number 19. Barley. Barley predates wheat as a cultivated crop in the Near East, and in the biblical world, that age gap translated directly into class lines. Wheat went to those who could afford it. Hordeum vulgar fed everyone else, and that meant barley was the medicine most ordinary people actually had access to. It contains beta-glucan, a soluble fiber with clinical trials behind it, showing real reductions in LDL cholesterol and improved blood sugar response after meals. The Ebers Papyrus documents barley in medical preparations, and the Babylonian Talmud references it across multiple tractates as a restorative for the sick. Fermentation pushed barley's medical profile further still. Ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian brewers produced beer as a food preservation method, and the fermentation process increased nutrient bioavailability and generated B vitamins through microbial activity. They weren't trying to make medicine. They were making beer, and the pharmacological effect came along for free. Number 20. Coriander. When Exodus describes manna as looking like coriander seed, that's not decoration. You don't reach for an obscure plant when you need a visual reference. You reach for something everyone already knows, which tells you Coriandrum sativum was growing in kitchens and fields across the Levant long before that text existed. Archaeological sites across the ancient Near East have turned up coriander seeds going back thousands of years, and it appears in Egyptian medical papyri and Mesopotamian texts independently. The seeds contain linalool and other terpenoids with documented antimicrobial and antifungal properties, and clinical evidence confirms coriander extract reduces gastrointestinal spasm and bloating through real pharmacological mechanisms. What's worth noting is that ancient practitioners distinguished between the seeds and the leaves, using each for different applications. Seeds went toward digestive and antimicrobial uses. Leaves went into topical preparations for skin. That's not folk medicine. That's applied botanical chemistry, confirmed by the Daphne and Bach analysis across 3 separate ancient pharmacopoeias. What the data shows across these 20 plants is that roughly 60% of them had to travel serious distances to reach the biblical world. Cinnamon from Sri Lanka, aloe from East Africa, frankincense, and myrrh from Arabia. The Holy Land wasn't producing its own medicine. It sat at the center of a global supply chain for bioactive compounds, and the people running that system knew exactly what they were moving and why. The 5 plants the Bible explicitly names as medicinal are just the narrow core. Daphne and Bach identified 45 species total by cross-referencing Egyptian papyri, Mesopotamian clay tablets, and post-biblical Jewish literature, and roughly 27 of those were already documented in contemporary Egyptian and Mesopotamian medicine. That's not an isolated desert culture. That's a procurement operation for high-value chemistry that ran continuously for centuries. And if you want more analysis like this, subscribe, because the botanical economics of the ancient world don't get nearly enough attention.